And we need to cater for, and I think they, depending on which side of the fence, they call it the pink elephant. If I were to throw a very unusual question at a voice experience, what's a nice way to handle that in a graceful manner? So it may not have the result that you're after because you throw this kind of wild question at the experience, but we still need to cater for that in some shape or form.
This is Velocitize Talks, and I'm Eric Jones. I'm here with Guy Munro, the Global Business Director at the Versa Agency. Guy, it's great to have you.
Hi, thank you for having me. Very good to be here.
I wanted to dive right in and talk about, what the impetus was for the creation of Versa Agency.
We looked at what the global market was doing in terms of technology, and obviously voice is very much at the precipice of new kit. And sort of winding back the clock, my managing director, she was on the board of an agency here, or an organisation here called Real Estate Australia, REA. And she was one of those people that missed the boat when it came to apps in 2007. So that was a bit of a driving force behind it. She didn't want to look at new tech and work out that she may be, or at an institution rather, where they may be on the sort of, feathering the gas pedal. So that was part of the impetus. But we also performed the desk research to understand what different markets were doing. In particular, we looked at the United States, and we looked at what app uptakes were doing in 2007. We looked at what devices people were utilizing back then. And there were some really eerie parallels to say that voice was something that would probably be here to stay. And Australians typically lean into technology. So there were a few things that came together to create that. But it was very abstract. Initially, we did not have Google Home in Australia. Amazon as a brand was not even present in Australia. Alexa was not even available as a technology platform at all. So the first 6 months were really tricky. There was a real pounding the pavement, evangelizing what it potentially could be to various clients. Then it started to take shape. Google dropped the product in market before Amazon, interestingly, and Alexa and Amazon came to the fore on around February this year, 2018. So we took a few clients on board that journey, and it took a while to kind of build that up, and we started to build the momentum and build out those skills. But it was very much looking at how we can engage consumers at a new level, but tapping into things that we know, things that we do every day, which is communication through voice. So it's been a bit of a wild ride. It's been good fun, but a few extra grey hairs, but good fun.
Voice does appear to be winning pretty quickly across retail, search, with devices, so on and so forth, digital marketing. Why do you think voice is winning?
I think it's natural. I mean, the fact that it doesn't come with a manual, it's like any piece of technology you do buy, whether it be an iPad or a phone or a new car, for example, voice out of the box to a certain extent, all those devices, yes, they do have a very small manual, but that introduction, the reduction of friction is a really nice place to be. I think I always go back to, personal use cases, and my father, who's 73, he came to stay with us about 5 months ago, and he's had open heart surgery. And one of the lovely experiences that we saw there was that I'd set up an Alexa in the bedroom, because when you've had that surgery, lifting your arms above here, you can really sort of negate the actual purpose of getting all that surgery done. So as a very simple exercise, we'd put that in there. So if he was rolling over on the bed, he didn't have to turn on a lamp. Initially, he was like, do I really need this? And I was like, just ride with it for a day or two and see how you go. Within 2 days, he just found it to be a really lovely experience. And he's now a really strong advocate for that space. So I think there's some really simple surprise and delight moments that you can have with voice. Another really simple use case as well, my wife, bless her soul, this feels like an Amazon TVC, and when I'd set up some of the dots in our household, I'd set one up in the kitchen just to be able to play music when the kids are having dinner and breakfast and that sort of stuff. And I was transitioning some of our devices, and I'd actually turn the dot off, and I was moving it to another space in the house. And it's quintessential. It felt like the TVC. She's walked in with with shopping bags, and she's trying to put on the bolognese for the kids, and she's like, "Hey Alexa, launch Ivy's playlist," and it didn't fire because I'd sort of killed the dot. And I can tell you, I got berated. So it's interesting that the need wasn't there. I'd sort of removed the pacifier, and I can tell you, I put it back pretty quick to kind of keep the marriage in check. But there are some really simple things that you can have a really great experience with voice. And it's not like you need to wire up your house as a smart home to be able to experience what the value or the value exchange can be. You can do some really simple stuff to make it, bleed into your life and have a great experience.
So shifting a little bit to the marketing side of the equation, how do you see brands beginning to market themselves on the voice shelf?
It's early days, and I look at some of the client projects that we've worked on. So Domino's Pizza, for example, was one of our sort of first voice experiences that we created, and we decided to, with them, collaboratively to do two things and do them really nicely. So the first use case was, hey Alexa, ask Domino's to order my usual. So it does some really smart stuff in the background with account linking and authorization and payment tokenization and so on. The second thing that it does with that is, hey Alexa, ask Domino's to track my order. So it's in 4 states. It's in the oven. It's on its way. It's being prepared. It's at the front door, for example. I think there's 4 states that it can be in. But from a marketing point of view, what they've got is obviously they've got their own network. They have their own pizza boxes, so they can actually advertise quite efficiently from a real estate point of view to be able to push that message out. So for them, they're very much an innovation company, and they do pride themselves on leaning into new tech. Other clients like Village Cinemas, for example, it was a really interesting project where it was initiated by marketing, and it was partly funded by the IT team to be able to help solve a customer service problem. So for them, it's very much a gateway to being able to help people, again, like my father, who is that person that will flip to the back of a broadsheet newspaper to find out when is the next session time for Avengers playing at his local cinema. The other thing that it does that off the back is, would you like me to send that to your phone? So it enables you to have like that gateway to commerce. So from their perspective, it allows them to market in a different way that they've not done before, but it also reduces some of that tension from the call center as well. So there is a business imperative that's not just around revenue generation, but it's also the ability to have that experience in your phone and have it as a marketing play at the same time, to be able to reduce some of that tension or some of the business challenges that you've got with a call center, which is an operational cost. But the marketing side is starting to evolve. It's obviously new here in Australia to a certain extent. We've had Google Home for a lot longer and Google Assistant, but we're seeing that Alexa, from a brand perspective, is doing some really lovely things, and people are really leaning into that as well. But early days at this stage.
Certainly these products, the Google Home and Alexa and even Siri to some extent, right? They're all helping the proliferation of voice. But at what point are they, in fact, almost gatekeepers, right, for voice experiences? And what else do you think is necessary for the further spread of voice?
I think the consumers need to, and brands, we need to create that sort of push-pull. We need consumers to want the devices or to want that in their household. So a bit like I was saying before, it may not be an imperative or an absolute necessity for voice to be present in the household, but it's a nice to have. And it's almost like if you remove that once you've experienced it, you do feel that there's a bit of a void. What we also need is we need brands to lean in. We need brands to actually invest in the space to create some beautiful experiences. So the opportunity for brands at the moment, especially in Australia, if I look at it, and other territories around the world where voice is quite new, is you've got the opportunity to be first to market. So owning the invocation name, we're almost back to the early days of domain harvesting. And in Australia, there's a very prominent website address which is called carsales.com.au. So just by virtue of the domain name, we know exactly what that core business is. So the opportunity for brands in Australia is to be able to be present initially when it's quite early. So there's that FOMO, don't miss out, because you can lean in before other brands get there. The other thing as well is you can polish the skills as well over time. So what we've done deliberately with Domino's, for example, is to do a couple of things really, really nicely and to be able to see what is working well. What are those kind of analytical drop-off points that we're seeing consumers go through the path? Can we improve that path? Can we make it more efficient? Can we change the way that utterances are created and so on? So the opportunity is for brands to kind of get there first, own the space, own that territory, own the hearts and minds and ears of consumers, but also to be able to sort of grow and evolve, like push out the MVP and then build that over time.
Do you think voice has the potential to kind of replace the web experience as we know it, going to websites and things like that? Since it is, as you said, a bit more of a natural, intuitive, kind of interface for humans, for people.
Yeah, look, I think it could easily be an extension. I don't see it as necessarily replacing what is inherently a visual stimulus, apart from people who may be vision impaired, for example. But we're seeing some really lovely use cases where voice has a massive role to play with people who may be sort of vision impaired, as an example. We definitely see it as an extension as to what you can do from a traditional website or an app experience. Another example that we built out for Coastal Watch, which is a surf brand, if you will. It's a very simple piece of work in the sense that you can actually pose a question, hey Alexa, ask Coastal Watch, what is the surf like at Bondi? And it will give you a result back with brand tonality, which I'm going to do a terrible job of trying to make it cool and surfy, but it will say it's 3 foot and it's pumping because it's kind of wrapped in nice language. But in the multimodal experience that we've created for Coastal Watch, which is using the Echo Spot, which has got a visual stimulus, what we're doing is we're extending that experience. So in this case, we're making it voice first, but the actual screen is actually adding a slightly different layer of value to that, the value exchange for the consumer. So we're definitely flipping that around. I don't think it will replace the web or a traditional visual experience that we're used to these days, but it will be an extension of that. And it may well be that you can then take that experience with you from a contextual point of view. Instead of it being physically based on a device, you can be outside in the home, or it can be on your mobile. It can be in a different scenario, if you will.
One of the things that's been missing from our experiences, digital experiences, has actually been emotion and things like that, things that are very human. Voice, for the first time, kind of allows brands and people to kind of tap into that. Talk to us a little bit about how voice has the promise to sort of bring more emotion into things. It can determine that somebody's feeling sad or happy and potentially serve up different experiences based on that emotion.
Yeah, look, it definitely can. And what we're building when we create the voice experiences, Australians have this very interesting way of posing statements, and it's almost like every statement sort of goes up at the end, so it sounds like questions. So what the device or what the technology allows us to do is to really harness what is a localized experience when we're creating a brand piece, for example. So when we're creating utterances, we look at the best ways to be able to pose content experiences back to consumers and make it contextually suitable. The other thing that we're working on as well is just to understand sentiment. So to your point, can we tap into what maybe people can be responding to? And there's some really beautiful use cases that are starting to come out. So helping sort of not-for-profits, NGOs, government institutions around, health and well-being. There are some really lovely examples of those starting to sort of come into the Australian market as well. But we're seeing that when we're creating the experiences, we start with its raw use case. What do we want this thing to do? And then we're spending a lot of time on what we call the VX, the voice experience. So that is, in the old days, which is 6 months ago, that's UX from a website perspective. But in this case, we're working on tonality, language, the way that content should be presented back to a user, or back to the audience rather. And there's a lot of work that's required there. So the role of the agencies that we work with traditionally, which could be your above the line or your content agencies, for example, there's a massive role for those guys to kind of lean into this space to consider how to build those emotional connections between consumers and voice. Interestingly, we're also looking at the early days of radio to see what some of those behavioral hooks that were created back in the day as well. So things like mnemonics, things like audio snippets, and we all recognize the Intel chimes. That's right.
Absolutely. And
so we're looking at those kind of psychological or behavioral hooks that we can utilize to create memorable moments for people. So one of the experiences that we created with Flight Centre was to look at the cheapest flight API. So in a really simple use case, it's, hey Alexa, ask Flight Centre what is the cheapest flight from, say, Sydney to LA, as an example. What we've then done is we have to cater for everything in between. So looking at those sort of super users or the power users that might know a lot more information about what they're looking to do. So we cater for, hey Alexa, ask Flight Centre what is the cheapest flight from Sydney to LA, flying Qantas tomorrow on business class after 3 or 4 o'clock or whatever that experience is like. But we've been very deliberate to create a sort of intervention role where we do actually get a consultant to reach out to Eric or Guy or whoever that user is to go through the experience to validate, is that confirmation that that's exactly what they're after? Is there anything that they can do to upsell that experience at the same time? But some of the behavioral hooks that we've built into that as well, at the end of that experience, we've got the Flight Centre, the jingle, if you will. Flight Centre, so it's a terrible rendition, my apologies, but we've looked at those early days of radio to understand some of the things that were utilised back in the day. So we need to be conscious that at the moment, unless it's a multimodal experience, we're devoid of visual stimulus. So anything that we can do that will create a memorable moment, all those sort of little 0.1%, they're all the things that we're trying to build into the voice experience to make it interesting and useful for people.
So that's an interesting point. Like, in a voice context, how do you give a brand a personality? And is that personality different for me, for you? As we sort of approach what personalization looks like in a voice context?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because one of the things that we do talk to when we run the initial sort of workshops, the requirements gathering, or the sort of the tissue sessions around what we think the voice experience could do, at a very basic level, we're saying to prospects and clients, if your brand had a voice, what would it actually say? And so at that point, we're trying to understand what the tonality could look like, because inherently, a lot of brands have got a style guide when it comes to visualized treatments. It's a serif font, it's particular types of color palettes and so on. When it comes to voice, there aren't that many brands that have gone to that extent to understand how a branded experience should sound. There are a number of organizations that specialize in the space, but you're thinking more on the, almost like the extensions of audio experiences. So one of the people I was talking to in Sydney a couple of months back was doing some project work with Microsoft, and with HoloLens, that was a really interesting psychological challenge that they faced. If they've got a visual experience here, but if you get an Outlook notification, should it come in from left to right? Should it be stereophonic? Should it kind of bleed in and bleed out? So there's a lot of work that goes into the psychology of audio that we tap into, and that does wrap itself into brand tonality at the same time. So we work with clients on, in its very basic structure, what do we think this experience should look like? And we need to give it context. So as a very simple line exercise, when we started the agency, we did a roundtable and we set up a Google document, and the brief was to the whole team, if I were to walk down the hallway and pass Eric, how would I greet Eric? So a lot of assumptions that you might make, that I might make, that everyone has a different view on what that could look like. So the permutations that could be, do we know what time of day it is? Have I met Eric? Can I see? Do I understand if I can actually see Eric? How close are we? Are we sort of high-fiving because we're that way inclined, or are we greeting each other in a different language? Because I don't even know if you're from an English background, as an example. So all of those contextual things we need to cater for. So in the case of like one simple question, if I were to greet Eric in a hallway, we ended up with about 40 different ways of that occurring, and that's at a very basic level. So when we're constructing that in a branded context, we need to think of the utterance. So what are the different ways that we might be able to go through a voice-based experience? If we're building one or two use cases, in the case of, say, Flight Centre as an example, we ended up with 40,000 different ways that you can pose a question and go through the experience. So there's a lot of work, there's a lot of labor that goes into making it a beautiful or a graceful experience. And that's where that kind of enterprise polish comes off, and that's the way that we sort of position ourselves at Versa is, you can build an MVP, we can build proofs of concepts, and we can do rapid prototyping and so on, but to get it to that point where it's comfortable and as a consumer you might feel inclined, it's a lovely experience, there's a lot of rigor that goes into making it beautiful. And we work very closely with partners like Amazon and Google to make sure that that is that lovely, graceful experience. And we need to cater for, and I think they, depending on which side of the fence, they call it the pink elephant. If I were to throw a very unusual question at a voice experience, what's a nice way to handle that in a graceful manner? So it may not have the result that you're after because you throw this kind of wild question at experience, but we still need to cater for that in some shape or form. So there's a lot of work that goes into tonality and branded voice experiences.
That was Guy Munro, the Global Business Director at the Versa Agency.